For this episode of Great Recordings, I want to take you back to 1948 to a town south of London and to a very ordinary domestic home. And in the living room of that home is a young mother with her two very young daughters. They're listening to the radio, and on the radio, the presenter is talking about the different musical instruments of the orchestra. And finally, they come to the cello, and they start playing the cello. One of the young lady's daughters looks up to her and says, "Mummy, I want to play that. I want one of those." Now, her mother was a very fine pianist who had studied at the Royal Academy, and so it was relatively easy for her to get hold of a cello and to actually begin to teach her young daughter how to play. Now, her daughter is about 3 years old at the time. Now, what she does is she writes some little pieces for piano and cello and teaches her the rudiments. But of course, very soon she notices, and other people too, that her daughter seems to be particularly gifted. So much so that she eventually goes to the London Cello School, or London Violin Cello School, as they called it at the time, to study further. Excuse me. Now, she just takes to playing this instrument incredibly well. She's obviously gifted, she's obviously talented, she's got the drive. The only thing that really is important in this young girl's life is music and her cello. So much so that by the time she's 14 or 15, she's basically given up on normal education. And she goes off to the music school, Guildhall Music School in London, and she studies the cello there. And she begins to win all sorts of prizes at the age of 7, at the age of 11, and then she wins a very big prize for the under-30s, which a certain John Barbirolli is in the jury, and that will come back later. Now, needless to say, I'm talking about Jacqueline Du Pré. And this episode's Great Recordings is Jacqueline Du Pré playing the Elgar Cello Concerto. And it's an extremely important and great recording. And in order to do that, I want to talk a little bit about Elgar and the music, just to give you a little bit of background. And even if classical music is not your thing, I hope you'll stay with me, because there are elements in this and in this story that come through every genre of music. For example, I've already said that she was born in 1945. At the age of 17, she's already giving concerts, and she goes into Abbey Road for the first time, and she records a beautiful piece of music called Kol Nidrei by Max Bruch. Now, if you've never heard this, it's only 10 minutes long. I will put some links. And she made a number of recordings of this with orchestra and without. But in 1962, 7 months before the Beatles even set foot in there, there is this young woman who is challenging everything about music. She's the future. She represents everything about the young generation at that time, and it must have been quite shocking in the way that she's playing and everything. But she is paired up with a pianist called Gerald Moore. Now, Gerald Moore is 66 and she's 17, and he's the wise old man of accompaniment. He's made a fantastic career accompanying the most incredible singers all over the world as an accompanist. And what is amazing is when you hear this, if you know maybe people like Oscar Peterson, well, when you listen to this recording and you hear how delicately he plays the chords at certain points in the music to give her all the space she needs to be herself. He allows her to shine and be this dynamic young 17-year-old playing this amazing, beautiful, beautiful music. I mean, if you like a crisp Chablis and you like sunsets in Tuscany or sunsets on the sea, and you like sitting on the terrace drinking a beautiful white wine, and this, if those sort of things touch your soul, then Kol Nidrei by Max Bruch, if that doesn't do it, I don't know what does. And the way that Gerald is playing these notes so perfectly, creating that space, is a wonder to behold. But this is 62, and our recording is 3 years later in 1965. And between those years, Jacqueline has started to play the Elgar Cello Concerto with some orchestras. And in fact, she ends up playing the concerto with the Halley Orchestra, which is based in the Midlands, in Manchester, north of England, in the UK. And their principal conductor was Sir John Barbirolli. He is so impressed, he immediately wants to record her. And he's a very wise man and obviously can pull strings. And the next thing you know, it's the 15th of August, 1965, and they're in the Kingsway Hall, and they're about to record what will turn out to be one of the great recordings of all time. Now, the piece of music. I promised to tell you a little bit more about it. Edward Elgar, British composer, very, very famous for his pomp and circumstance marches and the enigma variations. Not very prolific, doesn't really write a lot throughout his life. It's 1918. He, like everyone, is very heavily impacted by the horrors of the First World War, which is just finished. And everywhere around him, you can imagine in the streets there are still a lot of wounded soldiers begging, looking for work, maybe shell-shocked, shouting out. I mean, every family in the country is somehow impacted by the Great War. And he has been asked many times before to write a cello concerto. But I don't know if it was laziness or lack of inspiration or whatever it was, but he hadn't done it. And in 1919, after reminders in 1918, he finally sits down to write his cello concerto. Now, what is unusual about this cello concerto, it's in 4 movements, it's quite long, it's nearly 30 minutes long, is that the cello opens. It's not like the Beethoven violin concerto, where you have to wait and wait and wait and wait and wait while the orchestra's playing everything. You think, oh my goodness, this isn't a concerto, this is a symphony. And then finally the violin begins. No. This concerto opens with a cello, and it's and a big slide down, and it's like the cello saying, right, there you go, off you go, orchestra. And from that moment onwards, almost throughout the whole of the concerto, all 4 movements, the cello is playing. But this piece is not light and fruity like Elgar's violin concerto. No, this is more somber. This is darker. It's incredibly lyrical, very powerful, beautiful music, lots of contrast. So here we are. We're in the Kingsway Hall. It's August, it's 1965, and this is a very young 20-year-old woman sitting on a little podium right in front of the conductor, near the microphone, so that the balance is correct. And behind her are a whole load of basically old men. And apparently, I've only just recently discovered this, the London Symphony Orchestra, which is the orchestra in question, had been a row somehow internally in the orchestra. I don't know if it was over union rates or an argument between each other. I have no idea, but there was a very bad mood in the orchestra that morning. And Jacqueline Du Pré walks onto her little pedestal. She sits with her cello, and the conductor says, "You ready?" She goes, "Yes." And she opens with this fantastic line in, and that slide back down. And you can almost imagine her. In fact, there is a great video of her recording it later with her husband-to-be, Daniel Barenboim. And you can see there how sometimes she turns and looks at the orchestra. And you'll see there's mostly old men as well. So I will put a link in the description for that, because that's just great to see. I mean, that could be Jimi Hendrix, that could be anyone, a little bit out of in their comfort zone, but really in this strange environment, turning around saying, "Hey, you see?" It's worth watching, regardless of what genre of music you like. Anyway, she's opening. And you can hear it in the recording. There's a kind of battle going on between her and the orchestra. She makes a phrase, the orchestra come back. The orchestra makes a phrase, she comes back. And she's woff, woff, woff. And in fact, apparently, they go right through the first movement, which is quite long. It's like 8 minutes long. And they go right into the second movement, into the scherzo. And they get to the end of it. And then obviously they take a break. And apparently the orchestra burst into spontaneous applause, which was certainly not the sort of thing that was usual at that period of time. After those 2 movements, Jacqueline goes off for a little break. And when she comes back, there's a lot more people in the studio, because the words got out that something special is going on, something incredible, and everybody wants to come along to hear and witness the event. So there we are. 2 movements down, 2 to go. The rest is history. She's playing note perfect. The orchestra is incredible. I don't know how much rehearsing they'd done before, but if you think about it, it's quite a big orchestra. I think there's 4 trombones and horns, and it's a big orchestra. And you only need one instrument to make a mistake, to come in too early, come in too late, not quite be on pitch. Obviously, it's such a difficult piece, the Elgar Cello Concerto, that it's logical that you would assume that Jacqueline will make a mistake and that we'll need to do it all again. But obviously there couldn't have been many, because the whole thing is recorded in one day. Now, obviously there would have been more than one take of certain pieces, and at the end of the day, over the following days, they would have cut the best, maybe a few mistakes out, and cut in the best takes. But there was no pitch control, there was nothing like that, none of those kind of corrections, just a few microphones straight onto a tape recorder. But what I find interesting looking back is that this is the record. Jacqueline Du Pré is already wowing audiences when she records it, but you can see the old fuddy-duddy HMI, EMI, HMV management team. They're not even sure about giving her her own album. So what they've done is they made an LP of Elgar. She's on one side and Janet Baker's on the other. And she's singing some Elgar songs, Sea Pictures, which are very lovely. But it's weird. She should be having her own LP to herself. But still. And in fact, on the back, here's the back. You can see this text here is all about the piece, and only this little bit in tiny little text added in later is about her and how amazing this recording is. So this is obviously an afterthought. There's even a different size typeface to squeeze it in from EMI management or somewhere to drop this in. Well, this LP went on to sell 500,000 copies at full price and has never been out of print since it was first recorded. I don't know how many it sold in total, because it's gone to Warner Records now owns it, and it's distributed and it's been printed and copied into so many different formats. But I can imagine it's one hell of a lot. But the interesting thing is the young cellists that I'm working with the charity Young Belgian Talent, and the people I meet, this is still considered to be the go-to performance of this piece of music. In fact, you can say that Jacqueline Du Pré made this piece of music famous. She actually brought this one back to life, because in the first recording made in 1920, and I can show you a picture of that, you can see it's mechanical horns, and there's Elgar conducting, and he re-records it again in 1928, this time with an electronic moving coil microphone, because it had just been invented, I think, in 1923. There's lots of discussions about who invented the first moving coil microphone, but basically this is the first one that's used in a recording, I think, in the UK. This is the first type. You see the lovely little wooden frame it's got, which they sat the thing in. But this made a bigger difference to our appreciation of music than any other single invention. The electronic microphone did more for hi-fi than any other invention, because it turned it from a fully mechanical process into a process where you could have basically from 20 hertz to 20,000 hertz fidelity. So I digress a little bit, but I think it's important. And I also want to say here that if you are thinking about going to hear this, I strongly recommend streaming it or getting the CD. I mean, it's fun to have the LP, especially if it's a first edition like this one. But EMI put the whole cello concerto on one side. And this is something you don't often hear discussed about vinyl. Vinyl's great, I love it. But really, you should only have 20 minutes or 22 minutes of recording on one side of vinyl. I mean, if you do that, I mean, you've got the grooves. It's going to take the whole side, excuse me. And this is nearly 30 minutes. So in order to get 30 minutes of music on one side of an LP, you have to turn the volume down. Because basically, if you record it at a good volume to get a lot of information onto the vinyl, the needle that's cutting the groove is moving a long way. Therefore, it needs more space. So if you want to somehow go from 22 minutes to 30 minutes, you've got to turn the volume down on the cutter so that it's making a very thin, narrow groove and not stretching. Otherwise you hear bleed through. You'll begin to hear notes coming through from the previous side of the previous track. And so the quality of the recording is fine on the vinyl, but there's so much surface noise because they've reduced the quality, the volume, the intensity of the cutter. And that's a shame. You know, that really is a shame. But that's how it was. But before then, of course, when a piece of music was long, like in the 1920 recording version of this, they had to cut it onto a number of different records because there were 78 RPM. And so you would have an album. In fact, it's quite interesting. 78, to get a piece like the Elgar Cello Concerto, you would need maybe 4 discs or 5. So you'd have one movement maybe on each side or each disc, and they would put them together in what they called an album, and you would take them out of this album and put them on. And even when we went to single vinyl, the name album remained. That's just a little side step. So what have we got here? Let's just wrap up a little bit. We've got an amazing 20-year-old who is incredible. She is in some ways beyond compare. And to give you an example, there have been 77 versions of the Elgar Cello Concerto made since this one that I know of, and maybe there are more. And we've got all the greats, you know, we've got Yo-Yo Ma, we've got Misha Maisky, we've got Pablo Casals, we've got Rostropovich, we've got Paul Tortelier. In fact, talking about Rostropovich, the great Russian cellist of Jacqueline Du Pré's time, she went to study with him. And she went in Russia, and then she went over to Paul Tortelier at the time when she was starting to do concerts. So that shows you her strength of character and will to improve and improve. Even when she's becoming famous, she's still studying with these great people. Well, anyway, Rostropovich, once he heard this recording, he instructed his record label to remove his record from their catalogue, because he said, this is ridiculous. This recording is so amazing. Mine just pales into insignificance. And that was the greatest cellist of the time. Or some people say Pablo Casals, but he was certainly one of the greats. And all the recordings since, yes, I mean, even like the Peter Wispelwey recording is fabulous. The quality is amazing. The playing is amazing. The recording is amazing. Obviously, they can correct all sorts of things. They have more than one day to do the recording in often. All of those elements, and you might prefer one than another, but there's no doubt about it. I mean, the cellists that I know, I talk about Aurore de Cesse, one of our cellists, who we had the privilege of supporting in the charity. She openly said to me that she grew up with this recording. This is what inspired her to go to the highest possible level with her cello playing. But there's a very important part of the story that I haven't told you. And I've left it till now because had I talked about it earlier on, it may have coloured your interpretation of what I wanted to say. So, if you didn't know already, Jacqueline Du Pré, her performing career stopped abruptly at the age of 28 because she contracted the disease multiple sclerosis. Now, this didn't happen overnight. She started feeling the effects of it gradually, and her last performances were just nowhere near where they should be because she couldn't really get the intervals. She was playing purely by ear and instinct, and she had the control. She was losing the control of her fingers, of her body. She went on to live until 1985, but sadly, we only have recordings from her from the age of 17 until a few years later. But in that time, she recorded the most amazing amount of music. It was almost as if you could imagine that actually there was a premonition, but there wasn't. But she records the Haydn Cello Concerto, she records César Franck, Chopin, I mean, all of the big important Dvorak cello concertos, pieces, the Bach cello suites, everything. In fact, there's a really good box set put together by Warner, which is not expensive, and it covers basically all her great recordings, and I highly recommend that. But there's another aspect, and because you could see it as a tragic life, if that's one way of looking at it, I see it as a short life, shorter performing life than most cellists have the blessing to have. But in a way, it's not tragic. She's given us the most incredible interpretations of music. And when you're looking at what's the difference between her and maybe other cellists, one interesting aspect is, and I hinted at it earlier, that she left school at around 15. But I don't see any evidence of her really being what I would call an academic. And there's a very famous point where at one recording or performance of the Haydn Cello Concerto, she turns to one of the musicians and say, "When did he write this?" Now, many cellists will say, right, in order to play this wonderful concerto, and it's beautiful actually, you should understand the period of time that Haydn was living in, when he wrote it, and put more, should we say, academically, you should understand the socio-economic and political impacts of the environment in which his composition took place. However you want to put it, she doesn't study his life. She doesn't study his influences. She has no idea who he wrote it for or why, who paid for it. Was it a commission, so it had to be done quickly? Was he losing his position in the music world, so he writes something commercial to make everybody smile and love him more? Was it in competition with Mozart or someone else to raise to another level? What was going on in his head? We have the feeling from the footage and the diaries and whatever from her that actually she wasn't interested in any of that. She would take the notes, the musical notes, look at them, remove all the markings like andante, pianissimo, loud, quiet, soft. It's always written in Italian in classical music. Allegro, vivace, fast, very fast, ma non troppo, but not too fast. All of these things, apparently she would just ignore them, look at the notes and come up with her own interpretation, her way of seeing it. And that's what was so radical about her. And yet it always seems to make perfect musical sense. And ironically is often very similar to the way it was written, because it makes sense. So I thought I'd better add that as a little piece for you, because it's part of a very big story. What is the difference between a truly great, pioneering musician and an amazing professional musician? Both are sublime, both can communicate to the hearts and souls of their audience, of their public, but one is just a tiny bit more special. And for me, it's Jacqueline Du Pré. I hope you enjoyed this episode of Great Recordings. I will be making more of all different genres and types of music. In the description, there will be lots of links for you to follow where you can discover and listen to more on some of the pieces that I've mentioned here today. Thank you very much for watching and enjoy your music.